Good morning, everyone. What a beautiful day it is to praise God and worship Him. This morning, this week, I was in a waiting room. Whose child is that? Someone tell that child to be quiet. This week, I was in a waiting room and with Ollie. We were waiting for a doctor, and he looked at me and he said, "Daddy, what are you going to do when you grow up?" It really caught me out. I didn't quite know what to say about that one. I said to him, well, I am grown up, Ollie, and I already know what I'm going to do because I already do it. And then I was thinking more about it, and I thought, isn't that funny how as adults, when we grow up, we often think that things stop changing. You know, as a child, we're always asking, what are you going to do next? What are you going to do next? And then as adults, we stop asking people that, what are you going to do next? And we just say, what are you doing now? But of course, as adults, things don't stop changing. Things continue to have seasons. And although things seem permanent when you're grown up and as though what matters is now and there is no what's next, we need to remember to think about, what am I going to do next? What am I going to do in the next season of my life? And one of those areas in which we often feel as though it is permanent and fixed is marriage. And yet, we looked last week at the divorce rate of marriages, but really the number of marriages that come to an end is 100%. All marriages come to an end. And every marriage in this room is one day closer today to coming to an end. Marriages do end, they don't last forever. And so today we're looking at one of the ways in which marriages end. In fact, it's the best way that a marriage can end, and it's when someone dies. And so God has a lot to say about what we do in that season of life, in that chapter of life, when our marriage ends from someone dying. Now, we're going to take this text that Michael read for us, 1 Timothy chapter 5, verses 3 to 8. We're going to go through it and draw out some applications. Now, this isn't just for widows, though. You might be thinking, well, I'm not a widow, I don't need to listen today to this lesson. But of course we do, first of all, because even if you're not a widow right now, you may be in the future. And even if you're not married, and even if marriage and then losing a spouse seems a long, long way away, it's not to say that these things won't happen, and it's certainly not to say that you can't support people who are in this position. And in fact, this text on widows is mostly written not to widows themselves, but actually to the people who need to be caring for widows. So whether you fit the category of a widow or not, this text is for all of us today, and it's for when marriages come to an end, when death comes and a spouse is left on their own once more. So we're just going to go through this, just taking apart some of the verses and drawing what conclusions we can. The first verse in verse 3, honor widows who are truly widows. You might ask the question, why does the Bible say so much about widows, but not as much about widowers? You know, widows are women who have lost a husband. Widowers are men who have lost a wife. Why is it the Bible talks so much about widows and so little about widowers? There are a couple of reasons. Number one is that there are far more widows than there are widowers. Men are more likely to marry someone younger than them, which means that generally the man will die first. Also, men are more likely to die younger. Women have a longer life expectancy, especially in ancient times where you have warfare and where you don't have workplace health and safety, so dying on the job was a common thing. We also know in Australia, men are 3 times more likely to remarry after their wife dies than a woman is likely to remarry. So all of this means that in Australia, of all the people who've had a spouse die, 80% of those are women. And of those 20% that are men, they are far more likely to remarry. So the proportion of widows is far, far greater than widowers. There is just statistically far, far more widows. But also, especially in the ancient world, in many ancient cultures, women were particularly vulnerable because they couldn't own land and they didn't have many rights. Most of their rights were connected to being married. And so when that marriage ended through your husband dying, the widow would often lose their house, lose all the possessions, lose any right to anything. And so God really cares about vulnerable people. And of all people in the world, especially in the ancient world and even still today, widows are especially vulnerable. And that's why God in Psalm 68 and verse 5, he calls himself the defender of widows. God commanded his people to take care of widows. You look back in Deuteronomy chapter 14, Deuteronomy chapter 24, and you see that the people were to set aside money. They were to set aside their things and make sure they provided for widows. When God sent his prophets, he often sent those prophets to help widows. Do you remember Elijah? He was sent and he helped a poor widow to have enough food. Elisha also was sent to help a widow have enough oil. If you turn to Exodus chapter 22 with me, Exodus chapter 22. Here are some strong words that God has to say about anyone who would mistreat a widow. It says in verse 21, we'll read verse 21 and 22. You shall not wrong a sojourner or oppress him, for you were sojourners in the land of Egypt. You shall not mistreat any widow or fatherless child. And what happens if you mistreat a widow or a fatherless child? In verse 23, if you do mistreat them and they cry out to me, I will surely hear their cry. In the ancient world, when widows cried out, not many people listened. They were, in most cultures, considered outlaws, which doesn't mean they're criminals. What it means is that they are outside the law. They don't have rights as a human being because they have lost their status as a wife, and so therefore normal laws usually don't apply to widows. But God says, if you mistreat widows, I'm listening to their cry. It makes God angry to see widows mistreated or forgotten or neglected. In fact, when you read the prophets and you read why did God punish the kingdom of Israel and the kingdom of Judah, one of the main reasons that God keeps coming back to is because of the mistreatment of widows. Malachi chapter 3, Ezekiel 22, Jeremiah 7, Isaiah 1. All of these passages and many more describe how the people mistreated widows, and that's why God had judged them. One of the reasons why God had judged them. When Jesus came to earth, do you remember how he cared for widows? It was a widow who he raised the son of, who had died. It was a widow who he praised in the temple for giving 2 mites. Do you remember Jesus criticized the Pharisees because they devoured widows' houses? And so all of this reminds us that when we're asking the question, how am I going spiritually, and is God happy with how I'm living? One of the questions we need to ask is, how am I caring for widows? Or when we ask, how's our congregation going, we should ask, is this congregation looking after its widows? If you recommended a congregation, if someone said, hey, I've heard about this congregation, do you recommend it? Would one of the first things you say be, well, they take care of their widows, so that's a good thing. Sometimes we overlook some of these things as if they're periphery things, as if they don't really matter. But these things make up the core of what a congregation is about and what a Christian is about. When the church began, they didn't ask the question, should we look after widows? It was just assumed that they would look after widows. The first dispute that we see in the early church over how it's organized is not the question, should we look after a widow? The question is, how do we look after the widows? Who distributes the food to the widows in Acts chapter 6? And so what Paul is talking about in 1 Timothy chapter 5, he's assuming that you're looking after widows. He's not saying you should look after widows so much as he's saying when you look after widows, this is how you do it. These are the widows who you need to take care of. So, honor widows who are truly widows. Now, what does Paul mean there? Are there widows who are fake widows? Do you have to do a test? Do you have to get a death certificate of the husband or something? No, what Paul is saying here is the word widow, it means destitute. It means helpless and hopeless. And so honor widows who are truly widows means there will be some widows who get taken care of by their family. There will be some widows who their family brings them in and they will be looked after, and that's really good. But widows who are really widows, I mean really left on their own, really destitute and helpless, those are the ones that the church needs to pay special attention to. And he says, if you go back to 1 Timothy chapter 5, in verse 4, he says, if a widow has children or grandchildren, let them first learn to show godliness to their own household and to make some return to their parents, for this is pleasing in the sight of God. Notice here that the responsibility is on children and grandchildren. I've never picked up on that before, and it really slapped me in the face as I was studying this text this week. If you're a grandchild, you have a responsibility to your grandparents. We often don't think about that in our culture, or maybe that's just my ignorance here. But I often think, oh yeah, you need to take care of your parents. But Paul says you need to take care of your grandparents too. So parents, we need to be teaching our kids to mow the grandparents' lawn, to see that the needs of the grandparents are looked after. That needs to be not just in the children, but in the grandchildren too. The children and grandchildren have to learn to show godliness or piety, your version might say. And they have to make some return, or the New King James says they have to repay their parents. Sometimes, as a parent, if you're a parent, you might have had these selfish thoughts come into your head when you're changing a nappy at 2 a.m. in the morning, and you think, I cannot believe how much thankless work I have to do for this child. I can't believe here I am at 2 a.m. in the morning serving them, and they will never know about it, and they will never thank me for this. You know, my son isn't going to say, Dad, on the 4th of August 2024 at 2 a.m, you changed my nappy that time. You got out of bed even though it was cold. You changed me and I appreciate it, Dad, and I just want to say thanks. As a parent, there's all sorts of things that you'll do for your children and they won't be able to repay or thank you. But Paul says that we should repay our parents. Paul says when your parents are in need, then the tables do turn around. And something that might be uncommon in our culture, but should be common in church culture, is that children look after and repay their parents, however that might look. It may look like your parents coming to live in your house. It may mean providing money for them. Even on a pension, money can be tight. What it certainly doesn't mean is putting them in a nursing home, locking them away for them to live out the rest of their miserable years on their own. And sadly, in our country, that's a common thing. Here's a terrible statistic. Do you know which demographic in Australia is experiencing the steepest rise in homelessness? Old women. The number of homeless older women in Australia has doubled over the last 10 years and is expected to double again over the next 10 years. Isn't that terrible? Meaning that at the moment, 1 in 10 homeless people are older women, and that number is rising. Or you look at the aged care homes, and likewise, we are embarrassed of our country. We don't really know, but the best statistic that we can find on the matter says that 40% of people in aged care homes never get visitors. And how about this? A journal article published last month called National Trends in Antidepressant Use in Australian Residential Aged Care Facilities says that 60% of people in an aged care home are on antidepressants. 60%. It's no wonder that people in our country want to end life early when the future looks so bleak. And do you know, you know this, you don't need studies to tell you this, we all know this. The biggest factor on whether a resident at an aged care facility has depression is 2 words: family visits. That's it. The research papers say it again and again, but we know that, don't we? Family visits change that. And sadly, many people in aged care homes simply don't get visits. And so most people in aged care homes live on antidepressants. What a way to honour our parents and our grandparents. I have no doubt that if Isaiah was living today, and if Ezekiel was living today, and if Malachi were living today, what would they stand up and proclaim on the street corners of Australia? They would say, the way that you treat your elderly, the way that you dishonour your parents and your grandparents, God will judge. But this verse says, not that God is angry, but rather something that pleases God. God is pleased when children and grandchildren repay their parents. God looks down at that. He looks down at the person who goes and visits their mum, their grandma, all alone, who goes and has a cup of tea and brightens her day, and God smiles at that. God is pleased at those small acts of honour. Back to 1 Timothy chapter 5 and verses 5 and 6, it says, she who is truly a widow, left all alone, has set her hope on God and continues in supplications and prayers night and day. But she who is self-indulgent is dead even while she lives. So here's a picture of two widows here. Here's the godly widow and the godless widow. The first one, the godly widow, the true widow, the widow that the church really needs to be supporting and standing by and helping as much as possible. She prays day and night. Turn with me in the Bible to Luke chapter 2. Luke chapter 2. Luke chapter 2, verse 37. We'll read verse 36 and 37. Luke 2, 36 and 37. There was a prophetess, Anna, the daughter of Phanuel of the tribe of Asher. She was advanced in years, having lived with her husband 7 years from when she was a virgin. And then as a widow until she was 84, she did not depart from the temple, worshipping with fasting and prayer night and day. This is the picture of what a good, godly widow should be. This is what we should aspire to have in our congregation, training up people so that when their marriage is finished, and as Paul would say in 1 Corinthians 7, when you're no longer concerned with your husband or wife, or with your spouse, you can devote yourself fully to the Lord. You can spend night and day in prayer. Our culture wants to waste our retirement years, wants to blow it on caravan trips and all sorts of things. And of course, as part of honouring our parents, I see nothing wrong with enjoying your retirement years and, having a well-deserved rest. But also, we need to pray night and day. And even if you can't leave the house, and even if you're bedbound, and even if you're sick, and even if you can't mow the lawns like you used to, and even if you can't bake cakes like you used to, you can still pray night and day. On the contrary, here's the other widow who is self-indulgent. The other versions will say lives for pleasure. The word here means living in luxury. And don't you see that in the world today? People who retire and who just want to live in luxury, whose focus is on living it up before they die. You might have seen that bumper sticker, adventure before dementia. That's certainly the philosophy of our time, isn't it? But Paul says there's a different way for a widow to live. And so in verses 7 and 8, it comes back to the obligation that we all have to look after these widows. It says, command these things as well, so that they may be without reproach. But if anyone does not provide for his relatives, and especially for members of his household, he has denied the faith and is worse than an unbeliever. Worse than an unbeliever. For what? For skipping church on Sundays? No. For some great sexual sin? No. For murder? No. For not taking care of your vulnerable loved ones. In the time of Jesus, the Pharisees had come up with this very clever little scheme to get out of giving their parents money. They said, Mum, Dad, my money is Corban. That means it belongs to God. So I can't use it on you because I'm too busy being a good God follower. And Jesus calls them hypocrites in Mark chapter 7. Your excuses don't work with God. And I'm sure, like the Pharisees, we've all used our excuses before. I don't have time to do the visits. I'm too busy. I've got a lot on my plate. I'm too busy with going to church. I'm too busy reading my Bible. I'm too busy doing godly things. Or when I visit, I don't know what to say. I get uncomfortable. The whole experience makes me very uncomfortable. Or this one, I serve God in other ways. You know, visiting, I leave that to people who are good at visiting. I serve God in other ways. Visiting and honouring our widows is not a ministry that only some people are involved in and only some people are called to. It's not some gift that God has given to some and not to others. Visiting and honouring our widows is just part of being a Christian. James says in James 1:27, religion that is pure and undefiled before God the Father is this, to visit orphans and widows in their affliction and to keep oneself unstained from the world. Is that for some people or is that for all of us? It's for all of us. When Jesus hung on the cross, he looked down and he saw his mother standing there. And at this point, his mother seemed to be a widow. There's no record of Joseph in Jesus' adult life. He seems to have either left or died, and died is most probable. Turn with me to John chapter 19. John chapter 19. John chapter 19, we're going to read verses 26 and 27. It says, when Jesus saw his mother and the disciple whom he loved standing nearby, he said to his mother, woman, behold your son. Then he said to the disciple, behold your mother. And from that hour, the disciple took her to his own home. If anyone had an excuse to not think about widows, Jesus did. He was hanging on the cross and he was, it seems like, moments away from death. The very next verse, we read that it's finished and he dies. And so perhaps one of the final things to come out of Jesus' mouth was to honour his mother, was to honour the widow that he saw in front of him. Jesus had every possible excuse in the world to ignore the widow, but he didn't. And if Jesus hanging on a cross can take care of his mother, then I think all of our excuses evaporate. How do we apply this lesson? I hope you've already found an application, but just in case you haven't, first application I want to give is for everyone. Jesus says on the day of judgment, he's going to say to us, I was sick and you visited me. I was in prison and you came to me. Think about people who you know who are sick, people who have chronic illness. And it's very commonly older people. People who are housebound, people who are stuck in an aged care facility. Or think about people who are in prison. You know, you can interpret this literally, those who are in prison, but also I think anyone who's a resident at an aged care facility must feel like they're in prison. Anyone who's stuck at home, who can't travel, who finds it difficult getting out, they are in a sense also in prison. Jesus says we'll be judged on those things. That's a test of our faith. That's a test of whether we take this following Jesus seriously or not. For those who are married, marriage is so important to God that it's important to think that marriage is forever. It's not forever. Every marriage is drawing to a close. So cherish your husband and your wife for the time that you have left with them. And husbands in particular, it's our job, it's our duty to protect and provide for our family, but it is most likely that I'm going to die before my wife will. And part of protecting and providing for my family is making sure that I've done everything I can to make sure she is protected and provided for after I'm gone. Part of that is raising my children in the teaching and admonition of the Lord so that they will be able to look after my wife when I'm gone. But also helping my wife in her faith so that the church can look after her when I'm gone. Wives, remember to not put your trust, your ultimate hope and trust in your husband or in your children or in anything else, but be ready for the day when you're sitting in the front row of a funeral and you become the widow of verse 5, 1 Timothy 5 and verse 5. She is truly a widow, left all alone with her hope set on God. And finally, most importantly, for widows, Jesus said marriage is glue. That's what we looked at last week. Marriage is glue. And if you've ever accidentally spilt super glue on yourself, you know that it hurts to rip glue apart. A widow or a widower is broken. What was once one flesh has been separated again. And it hurts in a way that is a pain unlike anything else. Do you remember Naomi, Ruth's mother-in-law? She lost her husband, and they said, the people of Bethlehem, they said, "Hey, is this Naomi?" And she said, "Don't call me Naomi, call me Mara, for I'm bitter, and the Lord has dealt bitterly with me." When a person becomes a widow, it does change them. They are no longer one flesh with their spouse, they have been torn apart. But hopefully, in your suffering, you can find that the church family can suffer with you. 1 Corinthians 12 and verse 26 says, if one member suffers, all suffer together. But more than anything, as you have experienced death close by, let that awareness of death drive you to use every last moment, every last second of your life to wage war in prayer, both day and night. We need to be a church that supports widows. We need to be a church that supports the vulnerable. Because when we were vulnerable and when we were needy, Jesus came and he visited us. He didn't leave us all alone. And he gave up his life for us. And he asks us to go and do likewise. So let's go and do that. Thanks, God.